It's my pleasure to introduce Peter MacKeith. Since his appointment began at the University of Arkansas, I've had several opportunities to meet with Dean MacKeith, and each time I leave really inspired by the dialogue and the possibilities between the university and Crystal Bridges. We've got a few projects going on here that really tie us together, I think, forevermore. So it's really wonderful to see how he's embraced that relationship and will continue to grow it. Dean MacKeith's lecture is especially poignant this evening, especially for us, with Aalto's architecture, which has been described as architecture that is responsive to climate, to place, and to the culture of place. Very much the same characteristics that have guided the design of Crystal Bridges. And we know and we love this building, and so we know we're going to love this conversation. To say Peter's an expert on Aalto is a bit of an understatement, as he's written extensively about his work, lectured around the world on this topic. Born in Texas, Peter is an alumnus of Yale University and the University of Virginia, and has held academic positions in architectural design and architectural theory, both in the United States and abroad. After achieving a Fulbright fellowship to Finland, he has worked as a liaison between architecture communities of the United States, Finland, and other Nordic countries. He was awarded the insignia of Knight, First Class of the Order of the Lion of Finland for his contributions to the culture of that nation. And Peter began his tenure at the University of Arkansas back in July as Dean and Professor of Architecture at the Fay Jones School of Architecture. Throughout his distinguished career, Dean MacKeith has been a tireless advocate of design education, with special emphasis on professional practice, research, and publication. Please join me in welcoming Dean MacKeith.
I'll just say good evening as a sound check. I assume I can be heard in the back. Ethel, you're back there as my sound check. Thank you, faculty of the Fay Jones School. And good evening, everyone. It is a real pleasure to speak in front of you this evening on behalf of the Fay Jones School of Architecture, also on behalf, as the subject indicates, of the architectural culture of Finland. As Rod has indicated, I have lived the better part of my life between the cultures of the United States and the cultures of Finland, and find myself, I think, happily in that in-between space, explaining one to the other and vice versa on occasion. But before I go any further, not only is it a privilege to be here, but it is an opportunity for me personally, but also on behalf of our school and faculty and students and staff, to express our gratitude to the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art for their collaboration with us, for their belief in the abilities and efforts of our students and our faculty. I certainly want to single out not only Rod, but also Sandy Edwards, who has been instrumental in this cause, and helping me this evening, in particular, Sarah Segerling. And I know there's an entire staff of the museum who stands behind them. But it is a real pleasure to have that collaboration and to begin to speak of the future of that collaboration, well beyond what we are doing together with the Bachman-Wilson House and with the viewing pavilion that our students are currently constructing adjacent to it. But it is, I think, important to recognize exactly the productivity of collaboration in this cause, and that is exactly the cause that I advocate in our school constantly, that we are stronger together as a school through architecture, landscape architecture, interior design, and community design than we are as separate or autonomous disciplines. That is the world that we work in altogether. It needs complex proposals to address complex situations, and this is, I think, very much the charge that I take together with our faculty and students quite seriously. But that's not really what I'm here to talk about tonight, both the virtues and the opportunities of our school, but in fact to introduce you, if he needs introduction, to the work of the architect who first inspired me to enter into architecture. And I title this lecture Altos Identities to indicate that it is, of course, possible to know a person and to know their work in many different ways. I understand the role of an educator to be precisely that, to know our students in those many and complex ways. One of my colleagues in education has often characterized students as being possessed by turbulent souls. And those of us with children, or those of us who've been in education, perhaps can agree with that. But it is not just really a challenge, but it's a pleasure to work towards identifying together with students who they are, who they can be, how they can act, how they can contribute to the betterment of our world through design. And I would say very directly that Aalto and his work introduced me to that complexity and perhaps even to that mission. And that's, if there's an underlying theme that I propose for you to hang on to throughout the course of the evening, it is precisely that in understanding architecture, I propose we understand ourselves. In working with students, we understand ourselves. In working on behalf of others, we understand ourselves. This long-held cultural understanding we have of knowing ourselves is in fact achieved through knowing the world in all of its richness. The idea of identity, I realize, can be fraught with a number of understandings, and in fact I will propose through the course of the evening a series of perspectives upon not really the person, Alvar Aalto, but the work that he achieved together with partners and assistants over the course of a very long career. It, I think, is perhaps best to introduce you to Alvar Aalto by trying to shake his hand. A good friend of mine, an architect, Juhani Palasma, often says that the door handle of a building is the handshake of the building. I have not been able to bring one of Alvar Aalto's immense bronze door handles from Finland, but I am able to bring you one example designed together with his wife, Aino Aalto, the Savoy vase, first designed in 1937 and still in fabrication today through the Iittala glassworks in Finland. I will hand this, not advisedly, but confidently, beginning with you, and ask you to pass that carefully, if possible, but knowing that in grasping that you perhaps begin to grasp some of the sensibility and understand some of the emphases, in fact, of the architect's work, emphases on tactility, emphasis on materiality, emphasis on scale, emphasis on a manuality, so to speak, of bringing architecture and design close to hand. I'm here with this lecture on what I don't regard as a frigid night at all. I regard this in Finnish terms as a balmy spring evening. But I am here in part to speak about a Finnish architect who has passed away in 1976, who the predominant amount of whose work lies some 7,000 miles to the east in his home nation of Finland, but to bring that closer to us here for some very particular reasons. I think to speak about Alvar Aalto here in this building does have rationale and has value. One is that the AIA Gold Medal will be conferred in May in their annual convention in Atlanta. It is, as the AIA website tells us, to recognize a significant body of work of lasting influence on the theory and practice of architecture, and has been awarded now for more than a century as the Institute's highest honor. You will know, many of you, I hope, that Moshe Safdie, the architect of this building and many others in not just the United States, also in Canada and elsewhere around the world, is the 2015 recipient of the AIA Gold Medal. He is preceded in this honor by architects who also lie very close to hand to us. First and foremost, perhaps dearest to my heart and many here in the audience, is that of E. Fay Jones, who received that honor in 1990. And before him in 1949, Frank Lloyd Wright. And it's a rather amazing, I think, not coincidence, but it is of significance to know that we are truly within distance of buildings of all three of those architects. And it perhaps then begs the question, what is a significant body of work of lasting influence on the theory and practice of architecture? Perhaps that's our subject this evening. What constitutes quality in architectural work, excellence in architectural work? Well, Alvar Aalto received this honor in 1963. And in that sense, perhaps we might be all willing, I think, to enter into a discussion of what constitutes significant work in the theory and practice of architecture. But I'll put it another way, perhaps personally, but also perhaps of interest to you, that in the sense of the ways in which Aalto is held in esteem out in the world, certainly of academics in schools of architecture. Three images stacked on top of each other from different periods of Aalto's career, all of them by that same person, but all potentially capable of being understood in different ways. And I understood this most concretely in 1991, when on hiatus from my residency in Finland, I returned to the United States, to the University of Virginia as a guest professor, and returned to that school's search then for a new dean of architecture. You can understand perhaps how meaningful this is to me now. But in that search, there were three final candidates who were invited week after week, and they were positioned in front of the faculty of the school, and the faculty threw some very difficult questions at them, such as, name your favorite architect and why. And the first candidate arrived and was asked that terribly difficult question, and his response was, my favorite architect is Alvar Aalto. And why? And he referenced this top image here, which if you have traveled in Greece, you know is the theater, outdoor amphitheater at Delphi, that Aalto sketched as part of one of his many travels in Greece and Italy. He was obsessed with the classical world. And why? That first candidate said, because Alvar Aalto brought the principles of classical architecture into the 20th century. He represents classical architecture as we need to understand it still in the 20th century. And I thought, after having completed my Fulbright year in Finland with Aalto as its focus, that this was a pretty good answer. I could certainly vote for this candidate. But he left, the next candidate came, and was asked the same question, name your favorite architect and why. And this candidate, without hesitation, said, my favorite architect is Alvar Aalto. And I thought, oh no, now I have a split vote. Why, this candidate said, and he referenced this image here in the middle, which is a notable image, a notable place actually, in Alvar Aalto's early 1930s designs for a tuberculosis sanatorium in the Finnish countryside, really regarded, as we'll see, as one of the high points of pure modern architecture in the early years of the 20th century. This candidate said, why is Alvar Aalto my favorite architect? Because he is the quintessential modern architect. He is the architect who understood the ambitions, the social mission, the new materials, the promise of architecture to address not just environmental conditions, but psychological conditions. And that's why Alvar Aalto should be, in a sense, a guiding light for this school of architecture. I thought, okay, I could get behind this candidate. And the next week, a third candidate came, and yes, he presented this image, which, if you don't know it, it's a somewhat canonical image of Alvar Aalto's design, completed in the early 1950s for a new town hall, a civic center, in what was then post-war Finland. And Finland had been burned first by the Germans, then by the Soviets, then again by the Germans in a rather complex political position it had. And so the assertion of national identity and of civic community was terribly important to the nation. And just something as a small town hall, again, off in the Finnish countryside, was terribly important to national self-esteem. But this candidate said, Alvar Aalto is my favorite architect Because if you look closely at this building, he represents, and remember this is 1991, the first green architect of the 20th century. His architecture was responsive to climate, responsive to light, responsive to materials. It was the first sustainable architecture, or sustainably principled architecture. And I thought, I have to get behind this candidate. We have in front of us, at the least, setting aside those three candidates, a protean architect of multiple interpretations, of multiple understandings. And you could argue that perhaps all of us are simultaneously classical and modern and environmental, or perhaps all of us should be. But of course, at some point, a faculty has to choose. And they chose this candidate. This was William McDonough, at that point, maybe proclaiming himself the first American sustainable architect, and certainly that was of appeal at that time to the University of Virginia. But if nothing else, we could say, this emphasized to me that I was on the trail of an architect of many identities, many different characters. For me, however, I knew this already, because I will actually put a date on it, in 1980, the fall of 1980, I sat in a lecture hall, not quite as curvilinear as this one, at the University of Virginia, and I heard what amounted to my first lecture in architectural history and in the principles of architecture. And in the middle of what was otherwise my nap during that lecture, this image came to the screen. And this is Alvar Aalto's design, as photographed by Ezra Stoller, one of the great American photographers, spent most of his career focusing on Eero Saarinen, but came to New York at the 1939 New York World's Fair and photographed all of the pavilions of that World's Fair and took this photograph of what was then simply an interior design that Aalto installed into a rented space on the pavilion grounds in Flushing Meadows on Long Island. This image transfixed me. And I say this to students all the time. It doesn't matter to me whether you are transfixed by this image and by this architecture and this architect. What matters to me is that you are transfixed by an architect and an architecture and work and place and construction that captures your attention for the rest of your life, that wakes you up in the morning believing that there is a possibility that architecture can change lives and can assist us in living better. Why did it do so? I could not tell you then, certainly I could not have told you as a then 20-year-old student why it was so transfixing. And I will say still that I am still spending my life trying to understand what it is that's so compelling about these constructions, these sinuous forms, their wooden character, in fact, the entire curation of what was on display, the exhibition design, the lighting design, the sound design, the presence of nature, abstracted or real in this space, the attention to circulation, the programmatic dispersal of spaces around this interior, all of this continues to obsess me. And I would say that this is exactly the obsession that took me to Finland in 1990, because if nothing else, I needed therapy. I had to go and figure out a little bit more of who I was. So there is an educational role in all of this. And there is, I think, the aspiration, again, that architecture can be so compelling, both as a student, but also as a practitioner and to the general citizen alike. Architecture, in the case of Finland, has that central role and has had it since well before Finland became an independent political nation state. That occurred only in October 1917, as the Russian Empire broke up and the Soviet Union came into existence. Finnish cultural and political figures negotiated their way out of the Empire of Russia, treated really with Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin for their independence. But they had been arguing for that not just in political terms, but in cultural terms, in all the forms that culture can take, through literature, drama, poetry, music. If you think of Sibelius, those of you who know classical music, Sibelius is arguing for Finnish independence in much of his composition. But they had been putting this forward in architectural terms as well as in visual arts terms. I began to look at not just Aalto's design for that 1939 World's Fair Pavilion, but I looked at other Finnish designers and how they had attempted to make their mark for Finland at World's Fairs. And it takes you all the way back to 1900 here on the right. And this is the Finnish World's Fair Pavilion at the Universal Exposition of 1900 in Paris. So fully 17 years before independence, Eliel Saarinen, then a student, not even yet a graduated architect, entered a competition, won the competition with two partners, and still as students went to Paris and constructed this building on behalf of the then emerging Finnish consciousness. This type of alliance between architecture and identity, national identity at that, is endemic throughout Finnish culture still. A small nation, 5 million people, has the longest border in Europe with Russia or the Soviet Union. Take your pick, it amounts to the same difficult condition. Needs to establish its identity in as many forms as it can. And it has done so through architecture for its president's house by the architect Reima Pietila. It has done so through the architecture of its own embassy here in Washington, D.C., finished in the late 1980s by the practice of Heikkinen and Komonen, well worth a visit. One of the few truly contemporary buildings in Washington, D.C., and it continues to use World's Fair pavilions to this emphasis. This was in 1992 at the Sevilla World's Fair, where a young group also of architecture students, who I came of age with when I was in Finland, designed first the project in competition, won the competition, went to Sevilla, built this as their first project. And this is another history to be described of the value of an open, fair, well-juried competition system in promoting good architecture on behalf of the culture. But architecture and identity at the national level are certainly visible in Finnish history. This is that embassy in Washington, D.C., which is built, to tell you the truth, not from any material drawn from Finland whatsoever. The green granite is from Brazil. The copper is actually from the United States. The glass block is from Pittsburgh. Right? So all of this is, you could say, not Finnish whatsoever, and yet it communicates well beyond that flag, for instance, that this is a building of a modern, contemporary, progressive nation. That is its ambition, and this was precisely what the architects are attempting to say, that architecture does have representational power, that it can communicate value and identity. And again, as I say, I only show this to indicate that long tradition of the identification of architecture with the national interest is still something which is part of Finnish culture. Aalto sits very much in the center of that. So let's take a step back, though. And for those of you who are ready for a little bit of principles of architecture, let's look at least one way by which we can understand the work that will eventually begin to tour. There is always, with an architect, the possibility that there is a formal language, an alphabet, even a semantic, a vocabulary that they are using. I don't mean to bore you, so to speak, with a lot of text here, but I want to suggest in the center of this quotation from someone who has looked at Aalto's work for a long time, that there is the possibility of a formal language in this architect's work, an ideograph of two lines, one straight, the other serpentine. We can transform the lines into planes, and whether we view it as plan or section, it will recall to us the archetypal Aalto space, in which the juxtaposition of a strictly flat plane with a rhythmically wave-like surface seems to charge the air of the space. But the critic goes further and says this is not just about form, it's actually more deeply how we think, how we understand ourselves, something much more psychological, and suggests that in this a synapse between the curvilinear and the horizontal, or the straight, that we could see this as an imprint of the brain's processes, that there is to be found in the argument of an Aalto building a complementarity between the rigorous plane of analysis and the turbulent wave-like surge of fantasy. Now, wouldn't we all like to live in that space, somewhere between the rational decisions that we make and the fantasies that also animate our lives? That too is, I think, educational to think about, and certainly goes to the heart of understanding our identity through architectural form. And Aalto pursues this. It is visible, and it is visible in direct ways at the scale of that vase that you are passing around right now, at the scale of the hand, at the scale of the body. Certainly, it's possible, it's possible to see it at the scale of buildings even. The architectural historian Kenneth Frampton has spent a good deal of time examining the plans of Alvar Aalto and sees that in each plan form there is always the enclosure of an outdoor space, a courtyard form that is captured by a C-like form or an L-like form or even an almost closed O-like form. That is possible to see this in the way that rooms are formed around an external room. Rooms are formed around an external room. Rooms are formed around an external room. This is, again, a language, a formal plan language that many would argue is part of Aalto's approach. But those plans or those forms, C, O, L, mean very little unless they are given materiality. And the other side of that emphasis in terms of formal language is that Aalto's approach will always have a high degree of materiality and tactility, whether it's in brick as we see it here, or in wood, even in concrete, even in ceramic tile. And we'll come back to that as we move forward. But equally, as the critic earlier suggested, there is a possibility of understanding Aalto's work in more particular sectional ways, that is to say, cross-sectionally through the thickness of the space, and in very particular terms, which you might imagine to be of deep relevance to living at 60 degrees north latitude in the Western Hemisphere. In the Northern Hemisphere, that light and the admission of natural light is absolutely essential in the construction of these spaces. And here, too, there is always the possibility of seeing apertures that bring light into the altar space of a church, apertures that bring light deeply into the body of a library, apertures that bring light even into an auditorium space at a Helsinki University. To give you an example of that church space, there is very particular apertures that have been called out through this otherwise very smoothly surfaced concrete interior that drop light and dapple light on the back wall, highlighting the altar right at the end of this processional space. Light and its relationship to section and the opening up of sections in order to admit light deeply into them is, again, very much a part of this formal language by which we can understand Aalto's work. Now, we do have two examples here in the United States that Aalto was able to construct. 300 works that he constructed over the course of a long career. Two of them here in the United States, at least on a permanent basis. One is on the East Coast. This is the Baker House. It's a residential, or a dormitory for seniors at MIT on the Charles River, directly adjacent, in fact, to a small chapel by Eero Saarinen. But here, at least in this view, perhaps you have a sense of that serpentine language, that curvilinear form that we have now understood might be part of Aalto's formal approach, at least in plan. Here, too, we also have the sense of materiality that animates that basic formal approach. And it's important to note that these are not stylistic choices that Aalto is making. He's not, you could say, intentionally seeking the serpentine, but that a great deal of research, we could say, went into the ultimate choice of this form relative to the admission of light, the views from this, the maximization of space on a very limited site, and the adjacency to the Charles River itself. Highly rational understandings that then convert into something much more fantastic. Secondly, there is another building of Aalto's design on the west coast, if you are traveling out in Oregon, for instance, the Mount Angel Abbey Library, not too far from Portland, just down the coast. This is less a building of exterior shape and much more a building of interior quality. And it is that building where it is possible to see how, in the first place, the levels of book stacks, circulation areas, are stepped down a hillside, and how then that building is opened up to admit natural light from above in a very cool way from the north to animate or to illuminate the interiors deeply of those reading rooms. So both external form as well as internal form, part of that formal language that Aalto is pursuing. That is visible and can be visible to us even here in this country. So every architect might be said, I would propose, to have a formal language that by which we can begin to understand. That's one way of identifying what their work is. There's another way. That's the way that architectural history suggests to us. When we sit in lecture halls, when we read the books of architectural history, the canon, so to speak. I say this with a smile. Ethel and I, Goodstein and I, talk about the canon and its relevance or irrelevance all the time, but there is a canon of Aalto's work that is at least a primer, a way of understanding some of the significant works that begin to be perhaps archetypes for his work. One, as I've noted before, is that tuberculosis sanatorium from 1932 in a small village west of Helsinki, about 2 hours' drive, called Paimio. This is an image of that building regarded by the great historian of modern architecture, Siegfried Gideon, as one of the three great buildings of modern architecture of the first half of the 20th century. The other two, not to challenge the audience to answer it immediately, the Villa Savoie by Corbusier and the Bauhaus at Dessau by Walter Gropius. Aalto at that point was 15 years younger than both of those architects, a latecomer to modernism. This was his first really full building of any significant scale. And to have it regarded almost immediately upon completion as one of those zenith achievements of modern architecture says a good deal about the sheer facility of the architect as they came into possession of this language. A second element, or second member of the canon, is this villa, so to speak, a residential house for an industrialist couple, Harry and Maire Gulliksen. This is named in honor of Mrs. Gulliksen, the Villa Mairea, dating from 1937, 1939. It possesses that shaped exterior courtyard here, of which a swimming pool sits in the center. But it is, in its own way, epitomizes an approach that Aalto took to his architecture, less fully modernist in its overall language, much more individual in its collaging of modernist elements with vernacular elements, industrial elements, elements brought from the countryside as much as from the city. And I'll return to this in a few minutes. Another component of this canon is that building identified earlier, the town hall, constructed in the early 1950s as Finland is recovering its self-esteem and national identity. The name of this town is a tongue twister. There won't be a test, but it's Sajonatsalo, a small community of about 15,000 people at the time that had its own, again, aspirations towards larger civic sensibility, had a competition. Aalto wins the competition and constructs this in the middle of Finland, not a remote place necessarily, but one that very few people would see. This is not a building constructed for photographers. It's not a building constructed for a wealthy patron. It's a building constructed for everyday use to respect the everyday rituals and occupation of civic space in a very small community, really centered around forestry and forest products altogether. But while one architect that William McDonough saw this as an exemplar of sustainable architecture, we could simply see it as perhaps even a reassertion still of classical principles, because it calls upon laws of perspective, it calls upon certain proportional systems that are laced throughout classical architecture itself. And yes, it has this strong sense of materiality, pulls nature up this grass staircase into an upper courtyard and so forth. But this too qualifies, or has qualified, for the canon of Aalto. And a last building to go through a range of building types altogether is this church in the east of Finland, hard by the Russian border now, in another tongue twister name. Vuokseniska is the name of the community. This is the Church of the Three Crosses that Aalto designed in the late 1950s. Many have said it's his response to Le Corbusier's chapel at Branchamp, in its desire to use reinforced concrete in sculptural ways. Nonetheless, it sits out, again, in a very small community, quite remote from really any a photographer, but one that is very much designed to the service of the community. And I will turn to this in a moment as well. But this too has entered into Aalto's work as a part of the canon. So we have identities of architecture that emerge through formal language, that might emerge through what we're given by architectural history as the kind of archetypal buildings. But there is always, if we're honest with ourselves, an interest in the biographical. I understand, for instance, that sooner or later this year there will be an opera, is that right, Sarah? Focused on the dramatic life of Frank Lloyd Wright. And some of us know how dramatic that life is, or was. We have that human interest. Who was this person as a person? Well, let's say here's Alvar Aalto with his aunt and his uncle and his mother. He's 2 years old, right? He's on a sled on a frigid day in central Finland, very soon after his birth, really in the provinces. He was not an urban sophisticate, at least not to start with. That is not how that's not where he came from. He came from the country. He had a Swedish-speaking mother, and he had a Finnish-speaking father. And his, actually, what many people don't understand is that his first language was Swedish, not Finnish. This was not so strange in pre-independent Finland. But there he is, 2 years old. There he is with the big ears already at age 7. Here he is also with the big ears at age 12. Here he is as a budding painter. Aalto was always passionate about art, both as what it provided him as in a way, a storehouse of images, ways of representing the world, but he also painted himself from a very early age, and that he would say was his first calling. But he left that behind soon enough. Here he is graduating from high school in Finland, and here he is in architecture school in Helsinki. He journeyed to Helsinki from his central Finland birthplace to join all of these jokers in the studio in their architectural history class. Here is the equivalent of a projection screen circa 1917, a chalkboard on which the instructors would draw the great monuments of architectural history over and over again and have the students draw them in order to remember them. But Aalto is the one smiling. He's the one smiling. He was known to be a jovial fellow, fond of a joke and fond of a drink, also for a while fond of cigarettes. Here he is on his first journey outside of Finland to Stockholm. Here he is on his first journey to Copenhagen, in Paris. Here he is, we could say, full maturity, an architect of full ability in 1940, just after that New York World's Fair. Aalto came to the United States to oversee the construction of that World's Fair pavilion in 1939. Had an exhibition of his furniture at the Museum of Modern Art at that time. was courted by many, especially by the dean and faculty at MIT to join the faculty there as an emerging young architect at the time. He truly enjoyed being in the United States. Here he is actually at a hot dog restaurant, Robert Venturi, a hot dog restaurant on Long Island. Here he is at Empire State Building looking out over New York. Very much a man by that point who understood himself as a man of the world, who was moving from being simply an architect of national importance to an architect of international importance. That was certainly what the commission in New York projected him towards. And it projected him towards patrons as disparate as a Catholic cardinal, the president of Finland, to the secretary of the Communist Party in Finland. He took no prisoners, and he accepted commissions from all directions, was capable of working, we could say, ecumenically across the political spectrum, certainly. And this is, this is him towards the end of his life, and certainly here very much towards the end of his life, but always a man who understood that his first place from which he came and to which he owed a great deal was not only that central Finland birthplace, but the emergence of Finland as an independent nation state overall. Those were terrifically important to him as he worked through any range of building types. But in thinking about biography, there's always the danger of emphasizing the individual architect, of emphasizing the single author theory, as I call it. And it's important, even if we're interested in this human interest side of Aalto, to understand that he had two significant partners throughout the course of his life. His wives, who were also his architectural and business partners. His first wife, Aino Aalto, shown here, working with Aalto. They went to architecture school together. They married soon after graduation. They began their practice together, not as Alvar Aalto, architect, but as Aino and Alvar Aalto, architects, a partnership in which the woman came first. And that would not even be alphabetically, simply because that's the level of egalitarianism that prevailed and still prevails in the understanding of architects in Finland. It was a true partnership. Aino worked with Aalto in all scales, in all phases, interiors as much as details, and she certainly ran the office altogether. Aino passed away in 1949. Aalto remarried some 4 years later. He married Elisa Aalto, shown here, in the early 1950s. She too, an architect, licensed, trained, in practice. She ran the office, she ran the job sites. She knew how to build buildings, and she was a tough person to deal with. And I will say I had the pleasure of meeting her toward the end of her life. And you know, in the United States, when you meet someone, you say, "Hi, how are you?" Well, in Finland, Elisa Aalto held my hand for 5 minutes almost and looked at me up and down and at long last said, "I am fine." She did not ask me how I was. That was not her interest. And she had been in the United States enough to know that you needed to pay that kind of basic diplomacy, but she was not so interested in how I was and was probably a bit taken aback. I know now that I was seemingly interested in how she was. Very tough person. She ran that office. She ran that office after Aalto passed away in 1976 and saw a number of buildings after he passed away to completion. These were partnerships. These were collaborations. And standing together with them in the office as that office grew were assistants, students, as well as trained architects. The office at its largest was about 40 people, one of the larger design offices. So to say that this is really about Alvar Aalto, the person, is something of a fiction. It was a partnership, at least. It was a collaboration, certainly, I think, in most ways. And there was a true, a joining together, a collective approach to design, certainly as those projects moved out onto the construction site and details needed to be determined then and there. It's important, again, to emphasize that not just to students and it is important to do that, but also to emphasize that to all of us, just how collective an endeavor architecture is, economically, in construction, and overall as an expression of societal aims. We can look at, for instance, something very intimate in terms of design biography, and that's how Aalto worked in design. And he worked on long rolls of tracing paper. I think people here still know what tracing paper is. It still exists. He worked with a soft leaded pencil. He drew beautifully. He drew sometimes in a very enigmatic way. But increasingly, as I went through the archives, you find drawings that collapse any number of understandings of architecture onto a single drawing. Perspective, plan, section, detail, calculations. This for a church, this for that tuberculosis sanatorium, this for that residential dormitory at MIT, this for a sectional understanding of a skylight, this for that church, the interior that I showed earlier. He drew and drew and drew and drew. And then on his weekends he painted. That was his calling. That's what drove him forward. And those drawings were then handed off to assistants to clean draw, to come back to him, to draw over again, to hand off to his wife or to other chief architects to then go further with. It was a constant process of drawing and redrawing, beginning with these fantastic hand sketches. But there's another level of thinking more deeply about biography too, and that is, who do you know? What are you looking at? Which other architects do you admire? Frank Lloyd Wright was always a bit resistant to talking about that, but most of us, I think, are willing to admit that we look now at other architects, take inspiration from them. Aalto very clearly had those types of admirations. He was fascinated by the work of a Swedish architect, Erik Gunnar Asplund, who passed away before his time in 1940, most taken with Asplin's approach to detail. And I won't go into it at any great length. It would be an entire lecture to talk about these door handles designed by Asplund for the Stockholm City Library, the early 1920s, but all too evidently, perhaps, I think it's possible to see that there's a nude woman offering us an apple, and there's a nude man who is biting into the apple. These are the door handles of the library. Again, narrative, identity, as configured in architectural terms, now at the scale of the hand, the very scale of the hand. We have the idea of knowledge and its attractions as well as possibly its seductions altogether. On the other hand, Aalto was equally enamored with the work of another Swedish architect, Sigurd Lewerentz, who himself was equally interested in detail, just as interested in materials, construction, working with brick, with wood, with steel, and so forth. So these are known, and we can understand, perhaps through the resonance of this influence, that Aalto would gain a certain knowledge and a certain understanding of himself through those types of obsessions. The formal, the canonical, the biographical. We can also talk about the geographical. And Rod, in introducing me, said that I wanted to bring this lecture to you to call up ideas of how an architecture can be responsive to climate, to place, and to culture. It's certainly, these are reasons that have compelled me to come here and to work with our faculty and students. It's certainly, I think, ways in which we can understand the approaches of Fay Jones and many others, Moshe Safdie among them. But it's very much a part of Aalto's upbringing and his approach to architecture too. Siegfried Gideon again would say that one cannot understand Alvar Aalto without understanding Finland. In the same way that one could not understand, he said, we cannot understand Picasso without understanding Catalonia, or we could not understand James Joyce without understanding Ireland. Well, the national identification might go too far, perhaps even sound somewhat too chauvinist, but what we can believe in is that someone raised in these geographical conditions, surely, when called to architecture, would know almost first intuitively and then increasingly rationally that they needed to respond to these conditions. And what are those? Right? There is, I think, a romantic image of Finland which is perhaps true. It is a nation of lakes. in which water is almost 50%, if not in certain locales, truly more than 50% of the landscape. Right? It is a nation of forested, low hills. It's not necessarily their single primary resource anymore. Knowledge is now that. But it is very much still a part, and has been a part for its history, an important resource. Wood, timber, forest products, paper, and so forth. Whether we, and Gideon, in fact, saw the sinuosity of Aalto's forms being resonant of the forms of the landscape. That might be too literal, but it's perhaps one way of thinking about it. I put it another way, let's say in a more intimate way, as close as I could bring it to you without putting us all on a Finnair plane from XNA and taking us to HLE. There is still this landscape that's available. It's available 20 minutes outside of Helsinki, which itself is now 1.1 million people. There is that proximity to the natural world that is there. And growing up in that, working within architecture in that, you have to come to terms with this type of landscape. What is it to walk the forest? What is it to understand the species of trees that inhabit that forest? What is it to understand the character of the terrain and how it may organize your movement through the world? What is it, on the other hand, to go through midsummer after midsummer after midsummer with this type of illuminated world condition on June 21st of any given year? This is a photograph I took at 4 a.m. in central Finland on June 21st. This fantastic spectrum of colors and silhouette out in the lakeland. How does any of that begin to convert through architectural means into sensible, inhabitable form? Well, some of this evidence can be found in the visual arts and in vernacular culture overall. And it is so that Finland has been working in architectural terms well before the onset of the 20th century. It was exploring a painterly tradition of landscape painting as far back as the 1860s. It was exploring, in many ways, the importance of building in this landscape through painting at the turn of the 20th century. This is a fantastically symbolic painting called Building. And it is building both as noun and as verb. And it is building well in this landscape. It is building to resist climate. It is building on the basis of materials brought forward from the landscape. It is building in response to terrain. It is building on behalf of family and therefore community. And if you can see, those of you in the front row, there is a third figure in the classical triangle of figures. There is a third figure, a skeletal figure. It is building with a strong sense of mortality, of contingency, of the necessary role that architecture plays in sheltering us from all of the contingent conditions of the world. Yes, there is an ethic to building. There is an ethic to architecture, and that too is very much a part of this vernacular inheritance. It can be seen more physically and really in the outdoor open-air museum of vernacular architecture that Aalto used together with his classmates as one of their classrooms alongside of those chalkboard lectures in classical architectural history. They were also visiting these buildings because these were first brought to Helsinki from the Finnish countryside in the early years of the 20th century. They were measured by students. They were made part of the National Archives as drawings, and they are still part of a Finnish student's architectural education, to measure your inheritance in architecture, to take responsibility for it, to know the quality of wooden architecture in this case, both in terms of construction, but also in terms of how these buildings are organized in an irregular terrain of a forested landscape. Those become patterns that begin to be, come forward in your own architectural designs as you move forward in commissions. There remains still in Finland 80 wooden churches dating as far back as the 1600s. This is one on the UNESCO World Heritage List from the 1750s, which is a demonstration of wood technique of all kinds and scales in the the stacked logs, the joinery at the corners, the tarred shingles, the boards joined together into a simulation of vaulting drawn out of southern Europe. This is also part of that inheritance that a Finnish architect comes to know and with which their work begins to be imbued. Alongside of that vernacular tradition in wood, there is another material condition of the very bedrock of the nation itself, granite. And there is an equally powerful history of expression of architecture in granite as far back as the 1200s. This castle on the eastern border, built by the Swedes to resist the Russian invasions, now a national castle of the Finnish state. This, from the turn of the century, a granite construction for the first telephone company in Finland, and this from the 1930s, a granite House of Parliament in the center of the city of Helsinki. So that too, granite and wood, becomes very much a fundamental palette of materials alongside of the other palette, response to climate, response to light, that informs architectural decisions. And there would be, over the course of Aalto's life, from birth in 1898 to his passing in 1976, an entire transition from a nation largely reliant upon agriculture and living in the countryside to a nation, by the time of his death, largely living in the cities and increasingly reliant on industrialization. And yet we see a countryside formation of architecture in these lakelands, and here is the center of Helsinki, in which very similar types of constructions, or let's say a restraint in construction, is expressed in the middle of the Helsinki Park. How do you deal with industrialization? How do you deal with urbanization? How do you deal, again, with a nation attempting to define itself as an independent nation state, almost from the moment you graduate from architecture school to the moment you die? There is then the formal, the canonical, the biographical, the geographical. There's the universal. And I take us back to that first comment by those candidates for the deanship at Virginia who felt that Aalto was either both classical or modern. Either way, he was an adherent to universal ideas of architecture, as modernism declared itself the new universal language. It was true that Aalto was fascinated with the villas of Palladio and the architecture of the Renaissance. He was equally fascinated and cognizant very much of what Corbusier was approaching in the Villa Savoye. But we know now, of course, that these are related to each other in their interest in scale and proportion and a range of other classical principles. He was a visitor to the Parthenon many times over his life, and he was certainly a visitor to Gropius's Bauhaus at Dessau. Both of these, we could say, public buildings. Both of these, we could say, exemplars of the values of the nation-state as they were at that time, at least in the Weimar Republic at the time. Again, Aalto finds himself working in this in-between space, perhaps never adhering fully to these the classical style, and increasingly breaking from modernist principles. He was, as I said, fascinated with the classical world, traveled there for his honeymoon as his first trip down to Italy, toured there repeatedly over the course of his life, to the point where he became more or less an honorary citizen of Venice. He was there so often. Didn't enjoy Rome so much, rarely ventured south of Bologna, but enjoyed Venice very much. Often said that they went there, or he went there so often that people said, "What do you do when you go to Venice? You wander the streets, I'm sure." He said, "Well, Mrs. Aalto shops for shoes, and I have a glass of wine." While he was traveling, he was sketching. And he was sketching the ruins at Delphi, but he was sketching landscapes. And he was sketching ruins, not so much the great monuments of the classical world, but the lesser ones. If he was photographing a step closer than most of us would, photographing the detail as much as the overall colonnade. And in fact, there came to light at a point well on in his career, he chose to reveal more publicly through publications, that he had his own neoclassical period, especially right after he graduated from architecture school. He was commissioned back in central Finland to do a church, a social club, and here too it's very clear to see his adherence to certain classical precedents and to see his emerging fascination with apertures and entrances, doors, windows, and so forth, that interest in the human scale of the building, the detail overall. There could be zoom-ins to look at that door handle and that door handle too. But nonetheless, even as an architect working in this classical vocabulary, certain predilections come clear. He jumped, just to make this very clear, from this building, this building finished in 1925 and occupied more fully by 1927. This was already commissioned in 1930 and completed in 1932. It's a tremendous shift of worldview, we could say, cosmology almost, as much as architectural language. And it demonstrates, at least to me, a facility with the basic fundamentals of architecture altogether, that he could work to this scale, with this commission. Tuberculosis sanatorium, very complex in the 1930s, absolutely necessary in terms of public health, very complex in terms of each individual room as much as the public spaces. But he worked to great effect to bring this into being, winning this in competition too. It is a building which we could say is the ideal demonstration of the 5 points of architecture as Corbusier laid them out. The free facade, the free plan, the roof garden, on and on. And we see it here in the elevations, which are different on each and every facade of the building. We see it in this kind of ocean liner approach to the mass of patient rooms as they stand in the countryside. And at the same time, he was very clear that it was not simply an expression of those strict modernist tenets. He was very clear that he was absolutely interested in the psychological and physiological capacities of architecture. He designed stairs. There were elevators, but he designed the necessary stairs for patients to ascend and descend through the building with dignity, slowly, being able to pause and rest, even on the treads, certainly on the landings. The riser to tread ratio here is very, very shallow. And it is possible to gradually ascend without raising your heart rate, controlling your breathing, which if you know anything about tuberculosis would be fundamentally important to how this building would be inhabited, with always guidance along the way, so that the building itself nurtures you to the extent that a tuberculosis sanatorium could in the 1930s. You can move up through that building to this roof terrace that I showed earlier. These are period photographs from the 30s showing patients on a sunny day taking in the sun, resting, conversing. It was perhaps an atmosphere similar to that of Thomas Mann's Magic Mountain, where perhaps there was a certain melancholy that could hover over this facility. And by putting patients on this upper level, looking out to the horizon, looking well above the landscape itself, perhaps there was the suggestion that, yes, life, at least now, was good. Life may not last much longer, but for now, it was good. That at least was the ambition of taking you to this roof terrace. So, classical and modern, it can be both, as long as you're in possession of fundamental principles. But Aalto shifted, and he shifted very quickly after that tuberculosis sanatorium to something that we could call a more individual set of approaches. He made up his mind about who he was, how he wanted to work, with what he wanted to work, whom he wanted to work with, and really with what commissions. Working predominantly in public service, public buildings, as much as could be competed for and could be commissioned. He worked in wood as a increasingly dominant material, not just in structural terms, but in finish terms, meaning surface terms and detail terms. He explored this most poignantly through these types of sculptures, which I think qualify in some ways as contemporary art or modern art. They are explorations of the capacity of wood to be worked upon by machine, to be modulated, measured, sort of rendered rational. And at the same time it's an understanding of the organic or cellular or pliable nature of wood all at the same time. And I would argue that Aalto was equally fascinated by both. Again, that rigid plane of analysis as well as the fantastic expressions that were possible in this material, but that he truly wanted to be in that in-between space between those two forms. And we see this playing out very quickly in the mid-1930s. We see it in these sinuous walls that surround a very rational modular structure in this wood products pavilion that was eventually constructed. And simultaneously with those explorations in wood and its potentials to really express what he wanted to express in architecture, he became much more overt, we could say even political, in his belief that architecture's true responsibility was for the individual, for what he called the little man. And there's this wonderful perspective that was drawn for a newspaper building that he designed, in which he shows this individual, this worker, most probably on their way home from working in the newspaper plant, getting the day's headlines from this super graphic projection in the big window. He was concerned about that person and what they were thinking and feeling and how they could feel part of the larger project of the still emerging nation state. He designed ultimately what many would regard as the most bureaucratic face of any nation, and that is its Social Security Administration building. And this is the entrance of that. Multiple entrances, places to sit outside in the sun. These granite seats face south, so even in the wintertime, if there was a long line of people to go in, you could be out there and reasonably warm. But once you're inside, you would be brought into these individual offices where you could meet directly with the face of the bureaucracy, this Social Security worker by which you could review your accounts. And he designed these like small ship's cabins. These are brass fittings. This is a brass door handle. That's a leather desk surface. These were not cheap, off-the-shelf, standardized furnishings. This was dignity offered to the individual citizen. Now, the newspapers called this a building made of gold and criticized it for that approach. Aalto has been proven right, that this egalitarianism in design, this belief that architecture can offer more to all, I think has been proven correct as a way of emphasizing the virtues of such an approach to social services. So with all of this in mind, the formal, the canonical, the biographical, the geographical, the individual, the universal, etc., let's do 2 tours and then we can all go home. Right? So 2 tours. 1937, pre-war, Finland is, on the one hand, 20 years as an independent nation state, but it is, in fact, if we're thinking of European history, it is on the verge of war with the Soviet Union, potentially with Nazi Germany. In that in-between period, Aalto is commissioned by 2 friends that he has made in the wood, paper, and pulp industry, the Gulliksen couple, to design this villa for them. He sees it as a way of experimenting with architecture that could be applied to social housing. They see it as that, but they also see it that they have an art collection, they have 3 children, they have corporate functions to entertain people with, so it needs to be many things at the same time. He takes it as an opportunity to approach architecture not only in modernist principles, but also to overlay that with vernacular elements as well. So we see on the one hand this white box, which might be reminiscent of Corbusier, but it is overlaid with wood structures to soften the corners. These are ways of training vines to grow up over the corner of the building. He designs these pergolas and porticos that reach out into the entrance drive, themselves supported by wood saplings, so to speak. There's then finished wood that surrounds balconies up above, wood frames. There's only one building that Aalto ever designed with steel frames. All of the others have wood window frames to them. He gives particular attention to every single detail in highly particularized ways. 3 children, They get 3 bedrooms. This is a upper class family, yes. They each get individual projecting window bays that project out to the south. They become, in a sense, rooms lying outside the boundaries of the bedrooms, places where children can play on their own, where they can pull sunlight deeper into the rooms. He designs an entire range of wood elements in the rear courtyard. The building is shaped like an L. There is a sauna just behind us in this photograph, all too typical perhaps of a Finnish estate. There is no lake or seashore that you jump into. There is a plunge pool here, freezing cold most of the time, but nonetheless you look across this white canvas, so to speak, of really plastered brick, and you see wood railings, you see wood frames, you see finished wood board and batten structures. All of this is a constant overlay of countryside architecture, vernacular architecture, layered and layered upon modern architecture. This is Aalto finding his footing in the modern era in Finland itself. If we move from the outside courtyard to what is really an inner courtyard, this combined living space of living room, sunroom, music room, and art gallery, it becomes one all-purpose space. This too would be known, at least to Finnish citizens, as an abstraction of a basic approach to a vernacular house, this all-in-one room that is centered around a fireplace. And interestingly, of course, many of you might know that Aalto was designing this somewhat simultaneously, maybe just a little bit after Falling Water was being designed. Many suggest that Aalto was looking at Falling Water. He didn't have the site that Wright had in Pennsylvania with a waterfall and so forth, but he certainly placed the fireplace quite centrally into the overall composition. What's interesting, though, is that besides that fireplace reached on this dynamic diagonal, he also positioned this fantastic staircase and balustrade and railing system and so forth. It is not really a wood construction. There is steel that really structures all of this, but it is so overlaid with wooden secondary elements that you could imagine it as some abstraction of the forest very much. And again, think of who he's designing for. A wood industrialist whose fortune is basically drawn forward from forest overall. Not surprising, but you end up with these types of softened main treads to that staircase that almost appear to have been brought out of the forest itself and barely finished by the craftsman and then laid onto that steel support system. There's much more to go into in this house overall, but it is a tour de force of detailing. And I have been there many, many times, and I can say there is always a new detail that comes to my eye and to my hand. A second building post-war. Finland has survived the war. It's fended off Nazi Germany. It's survived the ravages of the Soviet army as they retreated back across the border. It is seeking to rapidly industrialize. It has war reparations to pay, but it also needs to understand who it is now in this post-war world. And this is where this building, the town hall that I've referred to a couple of times before, becomes truly important. And it is a construction no longer of wood, but now of brick. If you think of how brick is made, it's a module, it's assembled by a group of people, it has that type of assembled piece-by-piece character. There's a whole range of ways in which you could interpret this. Aalto would never say this explicitly, but there is that agenda that could be pursued, and I think is visible in this, that it is a building that aims towards a sense of civic good and aims towards the construction of a community in architectural terms. There's an artificial plateau in the middle of this composition that organizes social events, certainly in the fall and spring and summer. Through that courtyard, you come in through a portico and then begin a grand, in somewhat condensed way, a grand procession onwards and upwards into the town council chamber, into this lower vestibule, where the brick shifts from rough finishes to glazed finishes here on the floor, up through then this entirely enclosed staircase that winds around, lit from above. You begin to have wood detailing, the balustrade, the constructions here that soften the light as it falls from above. and you come into this very vertical town hall, town council space, in which Aalto has designed, of course, not just the enclosure, but he's positioned a wood floor, he's designed the desks, the chairs, the bench, the grill, and this structural system that upholds the roof above. Does this in to such an extent that seems almost overscaled, and certainly for those who've commissioned it in the city, it seems too expensive, it's too grand, and he says, but it's the same height of the town hall of Siena, and wouldn't you want that? And appeals to that kind of sense of the past and of civic grandeur of the past. What's almost most remarkable, I would say, are these two fantastic splayed trusses that truly overstructure or are overstructured for the dimensions that they span. Why are they so? This is always then a kind of mystery. We'd say, why does an architect, we could almost say, waste material or use too much material? There's a rhetorical value to this, which is so open-ended, and some have suggested it's, again, to indicate that type of collective that upholds the very shelter of the building itself. But Aalto's silent on this, but it is, I think, there to be explored more generally. Again, these issues of identification. A last set of fireworks, and then you're truly home. Because we can talk about buildings and we can talk about landscapes, but on the other hand, we can talk now perhaps sectionally across 300 buildings, a career of some 70 years almost. And in the end, perhaps we're not talking about buildings at all. We're talking about explorations of the real primary elements of architecture: roofs, ceilings, columns, stairs, doors. Aalto designed them over and over and over again. It was as if each time he came to the roof or the stair or the door handle, he got to design it new. He got to explore it again and again and again. These fantastic ways of opening up the ceiling to admit light. Perforations, particular prisms that drop through, slicing open the ceiling structurally, or even layering it in these, again, sinuous formations of wood. He explored column after column after column at a variety of scales. Oops, sorry. Oh. I get excited, you can tell. He designed columns of singular wood formation, of split wood formation. He designed columns as advertising mass. He designed columns as structural supports, internal. He explored these in concrete and in wood, less so in steel, but certainly steel, of course, as a part of the reinforcing system in the concrete itself. So an architecture of columns, an architecture of artificial lighting, as important in Finland as anywhere, given, again, we're living in winter most of the time, and there's artificial illumination has that primary value. Every occasion of a building produced a raft of lighting designs. For these World's Fair pavilions, temporary buildings alone, 6 to 8 different lighting designs, half of which were never made at all, but just a kind of joy at figuring out how different ways or different purposes could be illuminated through design. And of course, furniture, as I have in the spotlight here on the stage. In its simplest form, this stool number 60, which is now 80 years old. It's really the same age as our Walker Hall of the School of Architecture. But he explored wood in all of its pliable shapes, in all of its possibilities, in wholesale sections in these church pews, in these chairs that were designed for the tuberculosis sanatorium, in these fantastic chaise lounges. It's my dream to have about 10 of these, in fact. Retirement somewhere is out there, I'm sure. But it was an exploration, a virtuoso exploration of the possibilities of wood. And here, too, I think you're, in a sense, emphasizing or even maximizing the economic potential of your nation in seeing that kind of possibility in design. But what he truly wanted, which so many, at least in the Nordic region, wanted at that time, was that design would be available for everyone, of the highest possible quality and the lowest possible cost simultaneously. Aalto sought what he called flexible standardization, that you could, in fact, find variation even as you had a certain standardized way of working with industry. And he found this and became an exponent of that approach, especially in his furniture designs. Of more particular character, one-off characters, are his handrails for stairs. We see them here, explorations in bronze, and then even most particularly in his door handles. Again, every building occasion an exploration of that smallest scale of the building. Right? This is the main door handle to the Villa Mairea. This is the brass railing in the Villa Mairea stair. These are these very heavy bronze, cast bronze door handles for the Steelworkers Union, Metal Workers Union. These are wrapped in leather as a balustrade. This is wrapped in leather in Säännösalo Town Hall. Think, or maybe don't think, put your hand on those door handles in your mind. What does that feel like to have that leather in your hand, that bronze in your hand, to have this almost, is that a bone or is that a piece of wood that's been brought out of the forest, cast into bronze, attached to the door? There is that way of thinking about this. These appeal to our senses as much as they serve a functional purpose. I told you at the beginning that I was transfixed by this image, and I continue to be transfixed by this image. And what I suggest to students is never take that image alone as your education. I went to Finland and I found that Aalto can design, we can call them ugly things, that there are poor designs that were done thoughtlessly perhaps, or done offhandedly, or that were done when he was tired, or perhaps fatigued by age perhaps. It's possible. On the other hand, that's not really what we seek in architecture. We try to, I would say, keep seeing things from a new perspective. And I went to Finland and I found that I could look at this image 50 to 100 now different ways, and I would still be transfixed by it. So we look at that same space up close and look at the detailing and look at the graphic photographs that are used to represent Finnish identity on the world stage in 1939. We can look at from the opposite end of this space. Now we're all the way back there, looking back down the other side, and we're elevated, no longer on the ground, we're up on the mezzanine. We can go behind the scenes, so to speak, and see how these seemingly floating walls are curved and supported by an incredibly curved steel, linear steel support. And then they are actually hung both from the ceiling and suspended off of the sidewall through these steel columns, which are then softened further by rope, by wood, by climbing vines, and so forth. So the very tectonics of the building are a way of understanding it. And then, of course, we can see that this was a partnership that produced this building and really produced it, as Aalto would often say, with love. These are works constructed with love. They are works, certainly, ultimately this is the outside of that rented pavilion on which Aalto positioned Finland here and showed it attaching itself almost through lines of latitude and longitude to New York City itself. So again, to see us always in relationship to our neighbors, and of course at that point the United States was going to be a very important neighbor for Finland as it had to really resist the Soviets and Nazi Germany. Multi-perspectives, multiple identities, many ways of understanding ourselves, many ways of understanding architecture. There's a legacy. Toward the end of his life, Aalto designed a boat to take him to his summer house in the lakelands in the middle of Finland, close to where he was born. At that point, he was old, he was a bit disillusioned, he was being attacked, as can often happen, by the younger generation as being part of the establishment. He had started off as the angry young man himself. Now he was being called too old, too tired, too establishment, too elitist, so on and so forth. He named his boat Nemo Propheta in Patria. Has anyone read the Bible in Latin recently? Then you would know this means no man is a prophet in his own country, or a prophet is without honor in his own country. And you think of that and you think, boy, that's bitter. Right? But in an interesting way, this was not true at all. This is another way of thinking about both the person and the work, because here's one of the last works of Alvar Aalto, which is that he gets placed on the Finnish currency. Well before the euro, there was the Finnish mark, and this is 50 Finnish marks. It was worth about $10 at the time. Here's his face. Here's one of his other significant buildings, Finlandia Hall, in the middle of Helsinki, this grand space where, in fact, the 1975 Helsinki Accords on nuclear proliferation, or the non-nuclear proliferation, were signed. He's on the money. How much more can you be in the pantheon of the country? How much more respect and honor can you be accorded? Even while he was alive, he was on the money. So what does that sort of mean about your self-image when you're simultaneously nemo, pro fate, and patria, and you're on the money? As he passes away, of course, as can often happen, irony sets in. Finnish humor is very ironic, mostly. Mrs. Aalto, I am fine. Right? So here is, in the Finnish Forest Museum, a building not designed by Aalto, but they're demonstrating all the virtues of the Finnish forest. They have constructed the world's largest Alvar Aalto stool. This is 10 meters high. This is this incredibly big stool. It's out of I don't know, Disneyland or something. And at the same time as this was installed, there was a Finnish artist who took Alvar Aalto's vase. I don't know where it is back there. Is it ended with you, Ethel? At any rate, and suggested that these had become so ubiquitous, so inexpensive, you could buy them in the equivalent of Kmart in Finland. I'm not saying another mart. You could buy them in a Kmart, and they would actually be useful as Slurpee containers or as cheap coffee containers. That's how ubiquitous they had become. This was a form of honor through irony, I would say, but nonetheless, this is where one can get to in such a culture where design and architecture is so valued. As a last act of Aalto's own design, he designs his own gravestone. And he is buried there together with both wives, Aino as well as Elisa. They are in partnership. They are in collaboration. You could say that this, I could give the whole lecture based on this one thing alone, because it is classical, and it also has the negative form of the Grecian urn. It is modern in this abstracted granite podium. It is classical. This is a slab of marble brought out of the Carrara quarries in Italy. It is Finnish. This is all bedrock granite that provides the basic podium. It is in the middle of Helsinki, in fact, in the central cemetery there, but it is tucked back in the forest glade that is part of the cemetery, and they are bringing fresh flowers just about every day there. So it is natural as well as urban all at the same time. Again, we may never, each of us, have that opportunity to design our own grave marker, but we are able, he was able at least, to identify in many ways who he was, what he stood for, how he worked, with whom he worked, materials that were important to him, what he believed in, even at this smallest scale of architecture. And of course, it was Adolf Loos who said that the tombstone is really the only, the most important type of architecture that can be designed. I'm not going to end on a melancholy note at all by taking us to that final resting place, because Aalto was, if nothing else, an optimist who believed very much in the purposes of architecture and in how it could be attached to the larger purposes of his family, his community, even his nation. Those are the multiple identities that we all possess. Aalto suggested, well before he passed away, those types of optimistic purposes, and I regard those as maybe perhaps the best reason why I could have gone to Finland, to understand myself in these terms. I leave them with you tonight. Architecture has an ulterior motive, which always lurks, so to speak, around the corner. It is the only purpose of our houses. If we did not always carry this thought around with us, all our houses would become simpler and more trivial, and life would become, would it be at all worth living? Each house, each product of architecture that is worthwhile as a symbol is an endeavor to show that we want to build an earthly paradise for people. Architecture may not be able to save the world, but perhaps it could set a small example. Thank you for your time. I'll look forward to questions if you have them.